After 9 years of financial support, my parents texted, "You're not welcome for Christmas. Your sister's husband needs family space." I didn't argue, just replied, "Okay," talked to my lawyer, and quietly calculated the $440,000 I'd given them. When I stopped all payments and sold my lake cabin, they suddenly appeared at my door. I, 34M, stared at the text message on my phone for a solid minute before the words actually registered. 9 years. 9 years of writing checks, covering mortgages, paying medical bills, funding renovations. And now I wasn't welcome at Christmas because my brother-in-law needed space. The message was short, clinical almost. Mom had written that they discussed it as a family and decided it would be better if I skipped the holidays this year. My sister's husband was having a hard time with work stress, and having too many people around would make things difficult. They hoped I understood. I typed back a single word, "Okay." Then I sat there in my downtown apartment, surrounded by the minimalist furniture I'd chosen specifically because I spent so little time here, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, more like a door closing. The relationship with my parents had always been complicated. Dad lost his business when I was in college, right around the time I landed my first major contract in software development. It seemed natural to help. They'd raised me, sacrificed for me, and now I had money they desperately needed. What kind of son would I be if I didn't step up? So I did. First, it was the mortgage payment when they were 3 months behind. Then Dad's medical bills after his heart surgery. The property taxes. The new roof. My sister's wedding, which somehow became my responsibility when her event planning spiraled out of control. Her husband's failed restaurant venture that needed an emergency injection of cash. The list went on. I'd never kept a detailed record. It felt wrong, transactional. These were my parents. My family. But that text message changed something. I called my lawyer the next morning. David had handled my contracts for years, knew my financial situation better than almost anyone. I asked him a simple question. If I'd been making regular payments to someone over 9 years, could we reconstruct a total? He was quiet for a moment, then asked what this was about. I told him about the text. About Christmas. About 9 years of being the family ATM while my sister and her husband lived rent-free in my parents' basement, and I'd somehow become the outsider who wasn't welcome during the holidays. David didn't ask many questions after that. He just told me to send over every bank statement, every canceled check, every Venmo, and wire transfer I could find. He'd have his team pull it together. The number came back 3 weeks later, $440,000. I sat in David's office, looking at the spreadsheet his paralegal had assembled. Every payment, categorized and dated. Mortgage assistance, medical bills, home repairs, car payments, credit card debt, my sister's wedding, her husband's restaurant, emergency loans that were never repaid, even groceries, utilities, insurance premiums. $440,000. David leaned back in his chair and asked what I wanted to do with this information. I told him I wanted to stop. All of it. Immediately. He nodded slowly, then mentioned something else. He'd noticed from my tax returns that I owned a small lake cabin about 2 hours north. Had I considered what I wanted to do with that property? The cabin had been my escape. I bought it 4 years ago, fixed it up myself over weekends and holidays. My parents had spent exactly 1 weekend there before declaring it too rustic and remote. My sister had never visited at all. I told David to list it. The holidays came and went. I spent Christmas in Belize, diving and reading paperback thrillers on the beach. My phone stayed mostly off. When I checked messages, there was nothing from my parents. No Merry Christmas text. No acknowledgement that I existed. The cabin sold in January for substantially more than I'd paid. The buyer was a tech executive looking for a weekend place, and he paid cash. I rolled the money into index funds and tried not to think about what it meant that selling that cabin felt more like relief than loss. February brought the first cracks in their silence. Dad called on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a meeting, saw his name on my phone, and let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He called again that evening. I answered this time. He made small talk for about 30 seconds before getting to the point. The mortgage payment was late. Had there been some kind of banking error? He'd called the mortgage company, and they said no payment had been received. I told him there was no error. I'd stopped making payments. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Dad asked why I would do something like that. I reminded him about Christmas, about the text message, About being told I wasn't welcome because my brother-in-law needed space. Dad's voice changed, became defensive. That wasn't what the message meant. I was being oversensitive. They just thought it would be easier with fewer people around. Besides, it was one holiday. Was I really going to punish them over one missed Christmas? I asked him if he had any idea how much money I'd given them over the past 9 years. He didn't answer directly, just said that family helps family, and he'd never asked me to keep score. I told him the number anyway. $440,000. Another long silence. Then he said that couldn't be right. I must be inflating the numbers, including things that shouldn't count. I told him my lawyer had documented everything. Every check, every transfer, every payment. If he wanted to dispute the accounting, he was welcome to review the spreadsheet. Dad's tone shifted to anger then. Told me I was being petty and cruel. That I was holding money over their heads like some kind of loan shark. That he couldn't believe he'd raised a son who would abandon his parents over money. I pointed out that I hadn't abandoned anyone. I'd simply stopped volunteering to fund their lifestyle. If they needed money, they could ask my sister. Or her husband. Or they could adjust their expenses to match their income, like everyone else. Dad hung up on me. Mom called 2 days later. She tried a different approach, all sweetness and confusion. She didn't understand why I was being so distant. Had something happened? Was I okay? I told her I was fine, just busy with work. She mentioned that Dad had told her about our conversation. She wanted to clarify that they weren't upset about the money. They were upset because I was withdrawing from the family, punishing them, making everything about finances when it should be about love and connection. I asked her if she remembered the Christmas text. She sighed, said that maybe the wording hadn't been ideal, but I needed to understand the situation. My brother-in-law was going through a difficult time. He'd been struggling with anxiety, feeling overwhelmed. They'd all thought it would be better to keep Christmas small and quiet. I asked why nobody had called to explain that. Why it had been a text message, blunt and dismissive, treating me like an afterthought. Mom said I was reading too much into it. That I'd always been sensitive about these things. That maybe if I'd been around more over the years, visiting more often, I wouldn't feel so disconnected. I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked her if she realized I'd been around less because I was working 70-hour weeks to afford their mortgage payments, their medical bills, their property taxes, everything they'd needed while my sister and her husband contributed nothing. Mom's voice got small. She said they'd never asked me to sacrifice my personal life. If I'd wanted to visit more, I could have. The money was never a requirement. I told her she was right. It wasn't a requirement, which was why I'd stopped. She tried to recover, started talking about how family sticks together through difficult times, how we couldn't let money come between us. But I could hear the panic creeping into her voice now. The recognition that this wasn't a temporary tantrum. This was permanent. I told her I had to go. Meeting starting. We'd talk later. We didn't talk later. March brought escalation. My sister finally called. We hadn't spoken directly in over a year, despite living in the same state. She launched immediately into an attack. Told me I was destroying our parents. That the stress was killing Dad. That I was being selfish and vindictive over a simple misunderstanding about Christmas. I asked her how much money she'd contributed to their expenses over the past 9 years. She said that wasn't the point. She and her husband were struggling. They didn't have the resources I had, but they were there. They provided emotional support. They spent time with our parents. Unlike me, who just threw money at problems and disappeared. I asked her if our parents had mentioned the lake cabin. She hesitated, said she'd heard I sold it. I told her that was correct. And I'd also stopped making payments on their mortgage, their credit cards, and Dad's medical payment plan. I'd canceled the automatic transfers for their utilities and property taxes. Everything was ending. My sister's voice rose. She asked if I had any idea what that meant for them. For our parents. They couldn't afford the house without my help. They'd lose everything. I suggested she and her husband could get jobs and contribute. They were living rent-free in the basement. They could start paying rent, cover some bills, be adults. She called me a bastard and hung up. The visits started in April. I came home from work on a Thursday evening and found my parents sitting in their car outside my building. Just sitting there, watching the entrance. When they saw me, they got out. Mom looked like she'd aged 5 years and 2 months. Dad looked furious. They'd driven 3 hours to talk to me in person since I wouldn't return their calls. They needed to understand what I wanted. What would it take to fix this? I asked them what they thought needed fixing. Dad said I'd cut them off without warning. Stopped all payments. put them in an impossible financial position. The mortgage company was starting foreclosure proceedings. They were going to lose the house. I pointed out that I'd given them several months' warning through our phone conversations, and that I'd never promised to pay their mortgage forever. They'd been adults with jobs and income before I started helping. They could be adults again now. Mom started crying, said they couldn't afford the house on their own. Dad's disability payments weren't enough. They need to sell, downsize, move somewhere cheaper. And that was humiliating after living there for 30 years. I told them that wasn't humiliation. That was normal life. Most people couldn't afford to stay in their homes forever. Most people didn't have adult children paying their bills for a decade. Dad stepped closer, his face red. Asked what I wanted. Did I want them to beg? Apologize? Admit they'd made a mistake about Christmas? I told him I wanted them to acknowledge what had happened. All of it. 9 years of financial support. 9 years of me reshaping my life around their needs. And then being told I wasn't welcome for Christmas because my brother-in-law needed space. Mom wiped her eyes. Said she was sorry about the text. It had been poorly worded. They'd never meant to make me feel unwanted. I asked if my sister and her husband had contributed anything to the household expenses since that Christmas. Anything at all. Silence. I asked if my sister's husband still lived in their basement rent-free. More silence. I told them I was done. Not with being their son. Not with having a relationship. But done being their financial safety net while they prioritized everyone else. Done being treated like an ATM instead of a person. Dad said I was abandoning them. That I'd regret this. That blood was supposed to mean something. I told him blood did mean something. Which was why I'd given them $440,000 over 9 years without ever asking for repayment or recognition. But blood didn't mean I had to fund their choices forever while being excluded from their lives. They left. Mom was still crying. Dad wouldn't look at me. Update 1. 3 weeks went by with no contact. Then I got a text from an unknown number. It was my brother-in-law. He wanted to meet. I ignored it. He texted again. Said we needed to talk man-to-man. Said things had gotten out of hand, and maybe we could find a solution that worked for everyone. I told him I didn't see how his opinion was relevant to my relationship with my parents. He called. I answered out of curiosity. He launched into a speech about family unity and how his anxiety issues were real medical conditions and how stressful it had been living with my parents while trying to get his life together. He said he appreciated everything I'd done for the family, but cutting everyone off wasn't the answer. Maybe we could work out a payment plan. Something more sustainable. I asked him what he did for work. He said he was between opportunities. The restaurant hadn't worked out, and he was exploring options. I asked how long he'd been exploring options. He got defensive. Said the economy was tough and finding the right fit took time. I told him he'd been living rent-free in my parents' basement for 3 years while I paid their bills. That I'd personally covered $35,000 of his failed restaurant debts. And that his anxiety about having too many people around at Christmas seemed to have disappeared now that money was involved. He tried to backtrack. Said that wasn't fair. Said the Christmas thing had been complicated and taken out of context. I told him I was done with the conversation. Then I blocked his number. Update 2. My parents showed up again in May. This time they weren't alone. My sister was with them. They caught me in the parking garage. I'd just gotten home from a business trip, was tired and carrying luggage. They surrounded me near my car. My sister did most of the talking. She'd prepared a whole presentation. Talked about family bonds, about forgiveness, about how I was destroying relationships over money. She said Mom and Dad had already found a buyer for the house. They were selling, moving to a smaller place, taking responsibility for their finances. She said this was my last chance to make things right before permanent damage was done. I asked what making things right meant. She said I needed to acknowledge that I'd overreacted, that I'd hurt people, that my withdrawal of support had been cruel and calculated. I asked if she'd gotten a job yet. Her face flushed. She said that wasn't relevant. I told her it was completely relevant. She and her husband had been the primary reason for the Christmas exclusion. They'd been living off my parents, which meant living off me, for years. And now she was here lecturing me about family responsibility while contributing nothing herself. My sister said I'd always been like this. Controlling. Judgmental. Holding money over people's heads to feel superior. I told her I'd never once mentioned the money until I stopped giving it. That for 9 years I'd just quietly paid bills while they all lived their lives. The only thing that had changed was that I'd stopped volunteering to be used. Mom started crying again. Said we were tearing the family apart. that she couldn't stand watching her children fight like this. I told her she should have thought about that before sending me a text message uninviting me from Christmas, that she should have thought about it before letting my sister and her husband live rent-free while I covered everyone's expenses, that she should have thought about it before treating me like an obligation instead of a son. Dad finally spoke. His voice was quiet, defeated. He asked if there was anything they could do, anything that would fix this. I told him I didn't know, that I needed space to figure out what kind of relationship I wanted with people who treated me this way, that maybe in time we'd find a path forward. But it wouldn't involve money, and it wouldn't involve me pretending the past 9 years hadn't happened. They left. I went upstairs to my apartment, dropped my luggage, and stood at the window watching the city lights. My phone buzzed with texts, Mom apologizing, Dad asking me to reconsider, my sister telling me I'd regret this. I turned off my phone and poured a drink. For the first time in 9 years, I felt like I could breathe. The relationship with my parents hasn't recovered. We exchange brief texts occasionally, surface-level stuff about weather and work. They sold the house in June and moved to a smaller place 2 towns over. My sister and her husband found an apartment. Got jobs, apparently. I heard this through a mutual cousin, not from them directly. I don't know if we'll ever be close again. Maybe that door is permanently closed. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have handled it differently. But every time I question myself, I think about that text message, about being excluded from Christmas, about 9 years of sacrifice that earned me exactly nothing when it came time for them to choose who mattered. And I remember that sometimes the cost of being treated with basic respect is walking away from people who refuse to give it, even when they're family, especially when they're family. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot to us.